Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
For today's guest on our show, we have Gregory DiPippo, the editor of the New Liturgical Movement blog, an American who now lives in the eternal city of Rome. We'll be discussing the legend of St. Cecilia and the significance of a number of the churches in Rome in regards to liturgy and sacred music. Thanks for joining us on the show, Greg. It's great to have you.
Great to be here.
There are a number of things we'd like to talk to you about today, but first I'd like to start with the patron saint of musicians, St. Cecilia. Could you tell us the story or the legend of St. Cecilia and about the discovery of her tomb in the catacombs and the famous sculpture that was made from that discovery?
Sure. So the St. Cecilia, let's say, if you're a betting man, you're not going to lay down a lot of money that on the last day, when all things are revealed, that her story turns out to be historically accurate. It's a sort of later pious legend. One of the things that's kind of noticed about her is that some of the Roman writers, people who knew the church in Rome well, like St. Jerome, don't make any mention of her, and so she's kind of got the treatment from the hagiographical skeptics, as it were.
Sure.
So, but the story is that she was a Roman noblewoman and a Christian, and she was betrothed to a fellow called Valerian, who was a pagan, and so she winds up converting him through a series of visions, and she sends him off to go meet the Pope, who baptizes Valerian, and Valerian comes back, and then he wants his brother to be saved as well. His brother is called Tiburtius, so Tiburtius winds up converting as well. And there's a beautiful story of how that Cecilia says to Valerian, "Don't touch me because I am protected by an angel," and he says, he will harm you if you do touch me. So once he's baptized and he comes back, he can actually see the angel. The Roman prefect, a fellow called Almachius, falls in love with her. The prefect is basically the mayor of Rome, and the Roman prefects have a habit of falling in love with Christian virgins.
How convenient.
It just keeps happening. Sorry. And so Almachius eventually winds up convicting her of being a Christian. So the story is that she winds up having refused to marry this pagan. She's locked in her bath, and they try to sort of steam her to death. This doesn't work. And this is a really interesting sort of theme in the stories of the early Christian martyrs, that nature will not cooperate with the persecutors of God's saints. And this is the theme which I think is really, really particularly beautiful. St. Ignatius of Antioch talks about this, that when he was being sent to be thrown to the wild beasts, that he says, I hope it won't be as it has been with other people, that the animals just refuse to touch them. So with these Christian martyrs, they set them on fire. They don't burn. They hold them under the water. They don't drown. They throw them off a cliff. An angel picks them up, puts them back on top of the cliff, which is to say that the persecutor has to take responsibility for his actions, and nature will not cooperate. So he has to do it himself. And so in the case of Cecilia, they will then execute her. And in Roman law, the executioner had to get you within the first 3 blows. So he fails, and so he wounds Cecilia very, very badly, but he doesn't actually kill her. And so she winds up dying slowly of her wounds. Now, this is the traditional story about how Cecilia dies, and then she was buried as all Christians were in those days, pretty much in the catacombs.
Now, you said the story of Cecilia may or may not be apocryphal, but there isn't dispute about whether or not she existed. Is that correct?
The dispute would be that whether or not the church came to be called for her because she was a martyr. Or what some of the more skeptical scholars of hagiography would tell you is that the church was called after a donor of the property named Cecilia, and then a martyr with that name was found in the catacombs, was moved into the church, and kind of displaces the original Cecilia.
Well, that doesn't make half as good a story.
It doesn't, but also let's say that it is certainly true that in the specific case of Cecilia, there is a lot of confusion here, and so, it's just as fair to posit that the true story has been lost in the confusion, but why could not be the other way around, that there really was a martyr named Cecilia.
Right. Well, and there was a miracle with finding her body in the catacombs, right? So was preserved?
The body was removed in the course of the 9th century. They're removing many of the saints' bodies to the catacombs. So her body was taken to the church in the 9th century by a pope named Paschal I, who did a lot of this stuff. He's pope from 817 to 824. He does a lot of these things. He moves a lot of the relics of saints into churches. But in the year 1599, they were doing so she was buried in the church. In the year 1599, they were doing restoration works on most of the churches in Rome at the time. Actually, were getting a sort of overhaul, and so they open it up. They open up the tomb, and they find the remains. And the story is that her body is still completely incorrupt, to such a degree that they can actually even see the 3 wounds. So she is lying down, and her head is kind of turned away. There is a sort of cloth over her head that sort of flows away from it, but the wounds on the neck are visible. So a sculptor called Stefano Maderno, who was part of a family that were doing a lot of work, one of his relatives, Carlo Maderno, was the chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica at the time, made this very famous image of her, which when you go into the church today, it's now in a sort of, it's right underneath the altar. The altar is elevated, so there's a niche in front of it, and the statue is there. It's an incredibly beautiful piece of work. And certainly one of those, it's made the church an object also, as it were, sort of artistic pilgrimage. There are many other beautiful things in that church. There's a beautiful canopy over the altar. There's a beautiful mosaic, which Pope Paschal put into the apse. But that statue is a very impressive piece of work. And this is another one of the things which certain scholars, there was a French scholar called Hippolyte de la Haye, he's a French priest, who was very, very skeptical of this story on grounds which I think are a little specious, but it's so the discovery was in the church, not in the catacombs. The catacomb had been way back before, and so the body is now sort of behind that, where that statue is, underneath the altar, and what you see in the church is the statue. It's a product of the generation of men that is going to train people like John Lorenzo Bernini, Pietro da Cortona, Charles Borromeo, and you can sort of see Charles Borromeo, sorry, trained Pietro Bernini, Francesco Borromini, Pietro da Cortona. You see it's like the earliest little flowers in spring of the Baroque era, and all of the other truly glorious churches that you see in Rome from the 17th century. You see that there in sculpture there's like the beginning of this very, very impressive, technically complicated style of sculpting, kind of reflourishing, and of course always in the spirit of Michelangelo's Pietà. For Roman sculptors, they always think of Michelangelo. So yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful place to visit. It's certainly one of the loveliest churches in the city.
Yeah, and like a big musical pilgrimage, I think, for a lot of church musicians when they visit Rome. I mean, I was in Rome a few years ago, and I made sure I wanted to go to her church and to see the sculpture and pray at her tomb. So if any of our listeners have the opportunity to go to Rome, it's a wonderful place to check out. And
definitely.
Greg, could you tell us, is there any real substance in the hagiography about how St. Cecilia became the patroness of musicians? Is that linked to the more specious elements of the hagiography, or more credible elements of it?
I wouldn't call it specious, but I wouldn't call it credible either, in the sense that it comes from the legend itself, which is difficult to sort of say it's an historical document. But the story goes that during Cecilia's wedding, which even though she and her husband Valerian didn't consummate their relationship, they had the wedding festival. And the story is that there is an antiphon within her office that says, in the antiphons in her office are all based on the legend, the written legend of pieces that are set to music. And so one of the lines in the legend says that while the organs were playing, the Latin word is actually singing, cantantibus organis. While the organs were playing or singing, Cecilia sang in her heart to the Lord, saying, "May my heart be immaculate, that I may not be put to shame." And somehow those words, she sang in her heart, the celebration of the wedding is going on, but Cecilia is all thinking about God. Somehow those words sang in her heart, that words in her heart got lost. And so this antiphon is created, which is, while the organs were singing, Cecilia sang to the Lord, saying, "May my heart be immaculate, that I may not be confounded." And although it doesn't really say this explicitly, even in that sort of slightly shortened version of the text, the idea seemed to have been that she herself was playing the organ, which is really unlikely. I mean, brides don't generally play the organ at their own weddings. And so, but this came to the sort of this one of the rare examples where you have references to saints playing musical instruments. There are not a lot of other cases where something like this comes up. And this sort of led to the tradition that not only Cecilia was a musician, there are some versions in the later Middle Ages which will say that she was actually the inventor of the organ. That we know is certainly not true. I mean, there existed some kinds of organs before Christianity, the Greeks had organs. But so this is the origin of the tradition that made her into the patron saint of music. And I think it's really one of the things I always loved. I read somewhere, I can't remember where, a long time ago, that in many cases, when there were separate men's and women's choirs, that it was traditional to name the men's choir for St. Gregory the Great, of course, Gregorian chant, and the women's choir for Cecilia. And of course, this has also given rise to many images of her in which she's actually shown playing the organ. So it's a lovely tradition. I'm very happy to, pray this office every year on her feast day. But again, a betting man's just not going to want to light a lot of money down on its historical validity.
Sure. Well, going back to Rome and the churches in Rome, I forget how many. I know Rome has hundreds of churches, and each have their own history going back so many centuries. One particular aspect about certain churches in Rome are the stational churches. Can you explain for our listeners what significance stational churches have in the liturgy, I guess locally for Rome and then perhaps universally for the Roman Rite as it's celebrated throughout the world?
So stational churches are originally churches where the Pope himself would go to celebrate the Mass on particular occasions. In point of fact, like the oldest stratum, as it were, of the liturgical calendar, which is the saints' names that are written on the calendar, is a station list. So Cecilia's feast day is on November 22nd. And, it would be entered in the calendar because on November 22nd, the Pope would go to her church. The day after that to St. Clement, the day after that to the Basilica of St. Chrysogonus. So that's kind of the oldest layer, as it were, of the liturgical calendar. For the movable observances, Sundays of Lent, the Ember Days, Sundays of Advent, churches were assigned for a variety of reasons. Sometimes these reasons are clearly discernible, sometimes they're not. And in Lent, there was one for every single day. Ash Wednesday, right up through the octave of Easter. Many of the features of the lectionary are connected to the stational observances. And in Lent, they were preceded by a thing which is called a collect, which basically over the course of the day, the faithful would gather in a church not terribly far from the station. And then the Pope would come to the church. They would sing known normally, The Pope would dress, and then they would process over to the station. Station means stopping place. So that basically indicates where the procession stops. The custom of singing the Litany of the Saints during processions derives from this. So although the collects wind up dropping out of use pretty early, and in fact, all of the station churches, which are, they are among the oldest churches in the entire city of Rome, almost all of them still exist. And some of them have been demolished, but the station was moved somewhere else. Some of the collect churches do not exist anymore and were never replaced. So that aspect of it kind of fell out of use and has only been very, very, very partially revived.
How many stational churches are there?
It's about 40.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Some of them repeat. So, for example, there are 2 at St. Peter's in Lent. There's a couple in Mary Major. So it's not a separate one for necessarily every single day. Every day has one, but a few of them are repeated within the season. And then in Advent, it's less developed. So in Advent, there are 7 stations, but they're only held at 4 churches. So 3 of them are repeated. But it's a thing which is, it was actually imitated by a lot of places. It's not an exclusively Roman custom. So there are still actually churches to this day where in one form or another they sort of imitate the Roman custom. Some of them actually, it sort of emerged at the same time. The city of Paris had stations not every day of Lent, just 3 days a week actually. But that's a really, really ancient custom, as ancient as the Roman ones. I think one of the things that when you ask about, the significance for the universal church is that because they're listed they were traditionally listed in the missal, so that, when that missal went abroad to first within Europe, but then, goes to Africa, the New World, the Far East, there's a little bit of Roman history that goes along with it, a sort of memory of the origins of Christianity, and specifically the Roman liturgical tradition, which we use. The stations that are listed in the book that the priest is saying Mass out of kind of, make that connection and remind us of where we as a church come from in a certain sense.
Right, that it has a geographical place, which I think for people who haven't traveled or haven't seen Rome or different places, sometimes it can just sound like ideas, but then when you go there, it's wow, this is real, this is amazing. I don't know, when I went to Rome for the first time, that's what I kind of felt, that I had seen pictures and seen things on TV, but it all becomes real as you experience it, real personally, not like it's any realer than it was before you were there, but it becomes real for you,
Oh, no, definitely. And it's like, you think about, a saint whose feast day you've, thought of for many, many years, and you actually go to the place where that saint is, whether it's Rome or somewhere else,
Right.
It's different. It's a different thing.
So we'd like to change gears a little bit away from Rome, but still in Rome, ironically. Sure. You've served at the Divine Liturgy at the Collegium Russicum in Rome, and that's a college for Russian Catholics and Russian Catholic missionaries. Could you tell us a little bit about the unique musical tradition that has developed at the Russicum?
Yeah, sure. This is one of my favorite things in the world, actually. So the Russian College was founded by Pope Pius XI in the early 1930s. And it was intended to, send Catholics of the Byzantine Rite, who are very, very few in Russia itself, back to the country and sort of, promote union with Rome, but, fully respecting the liturgical tradition. The Russian choral tradition is actually very much a creation of the 18th century, when particularly Peter the Great's sort of westernizing movement, and very, very Italianate music. So the masters of the chapel in the court in St. Petersburg were all Italians until the late 18th century. So they the style that they created, this is the same period in which opera emerged in Rome. I don't know if you know this, that if you've ever heard the story, which I think is so fascinating, that the very first opera that was ever performed in Rome, the libretto was composed by a cardinal who later became Pope Clement IX.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that great?
Yeah.
It's an interesting little anecdote. And so that the sort of operatic style arise from the Italians in Russia, and they definitely kept it more restrained than the Italians did, because it is, within the Byzantine tradition. They don't use musical instruments in church, but there is a tendency, which is very notable, that they tend to sing. They prefer men's choirs to women or mixed. There is a strong tendency to sing fortissimo like all the time. You can find a lot of recordings. And I don't say this, of course, in any way as a criticism, because it's the tradition that they're working in. But there's a monastery in Moscow called the Sretensky Monastery, which has a very well-known and well-respected choir. But it's true that they tend to sing basically everything fortissimo. So in 1948, a Jesuit priest named Father Ludwig Pichler, he was born in 1915 in what is now the state of Bosnia. It was then part of the Austrian Empire. So he was ordained a priest, and in 1948 he was appointed the director of the choir. And what Father Pichler basically did was sort of take out the operatic leanings or tendencies, whatever you want to call them, and so the tenors are all in the same place. There's much more space for women, and the Russicum is really, I think, at its best when we have women singing along with the choir. And it's a real liturgical music. It's not performance. It has no hint of performance about it. It's lighter and more delicate than a lot of the music that you hear in Russia. And Father Pichler also did an enormous amount of original compositions. And then he also did a lot of work in taking traditional melodies that were mostly passed on orally and transcribing them. So the archive has something about 6,000 of his scores.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he directed the choir for 61 years and retired in the year 2009 at the age of 93.
Wow. Do you know if any of his music is on YouTube?
There is one video that I found thus far of Pentecost, which is recorded. It's absolutely beautiful. It was recorded the year shortly before he retired. Yeah, I'll send you the link. And you can see that he created a style that can function. In that particular video, I think there's only 7 or 8 people in the choir.
For our listeners, we'll try to find that video and then include it in our show notes page so you can listen to it on our website.
So for people visiting Rome, going on pilgrimage there or whatever, where would you particularly recommend they go to hear beautiful sacred music, whether it's at Mass or Vespers?
There are a number of places where you do see really sort of grand ceremonies. The Italian choirs tend to stick to an Italian repertoire. So you hear, you hear things from sort of the beginning of the Tridentine period, let's say roughly 1550 to 1750. And so a good example would, they celebrate Vespers at St. Peter's every Sunday at 5 p.m. And also first Vespers of every major solemnity. First and second Vespers of every major solemnity, like All Saints. The Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, St. Mary Major, has a big chapter mass at 10 o'clock. There is often a decent choir at the Pantheon. The Fraternity of St. Peter's Church in Rome, which is called Santissima Trinità dei Pellegrini, the Most Holy Trinity of the Pilgrims, has a professional choir. They do solemn mass every Sunday, and many of them every Sunday and every holy day of obligation at 11 o'clock. And they are pretty good. So they also do the ceremonies extremely well there. They're really in this sort of exemplary model for how the ceremony should be done. Those are the major features of the musical life of the city of Rome. And so, I'm sorry, and also Vespers at Sant'Anselmo, the Pontifical Athenaeum for liturgy, on Saturday and Sunday evenings, which is done. It's a Benedictine house, so they have Benedictines from all over the world, and they do Vespers pretty well as well.
I'll have to check that out next time in Rome.
Yeah.
Before we go, Greg, I want you to talk briefly about the New Liturgical Movement blog, where you serve as editor, and how the blog is used to teach people all around the world about liturgy and about sacred art and music.
Sure. New Liturgical Movement was founded by a Canadian named Sean Tribe, who took the title from a talk. I can't remember if it was a talk or a book, actually, of then Cardinal Ratzinger, who said that the Catholic Church needs a new liturgical movement. And so Sean founded this in the year 2005. He and I met in Rome, and he invited me to start writing for it. And I'm embarrassed to say that it took me a really long time to take up his invitation. But when Sean decided to retire, I became first the managing editor under Jeffrey Tucker, and then now I'm the editor. And basically our mission is to talk about the entire breadth of the Catholic liturgical tradition. So we do focus on the extraordinary form, but not exclusively, but every aspect of it, including music. And so I like to do pieces where I'll just find a nice video on YouTube of a good recording of some part of the repertoire and just put up the text and the video. As you know, this is a thing this is a liturgical text for the day. We write articles about every other aspect of the liturgy as well. But and the idea is that it should be the complete presentation of all the aspects of the liturgy: music, sacred art, vestments, church architecture, liturgical texts, which is really my personal sort of focus. And so to try to get people to try to increase people's awareness of the complete richness of the Catholic tradition in all of its, the Catholic liturgical tradition in all of its aspects.
Yeah, I know for me personally, I've learned a lot from reading a lot of articles over the years at the website, but then I also find it encouraging. One of the things I like is you do the photo posts for feasts.
Oh, yes.
And so people send in photos of, different liturgical celebrations from throughout the world. And I always enjoy that because you can see the church's liturgy being celebrated beautifully throughout the world. And it's really inspiring. And I think a lot of times people who work in the church, whether musicians or priests or just altar servers and laity, it can feel isolating, if you're just educated from reading things online. But you can see into churches from throughout the world doing the same things you're doing or similar things or having a passion to worship God beautifully. It's always helpful and inspiring, which is one of the things I really like about the blog.
Well, I'm very glad to hear you say that. I've had a lot of people who said something to me, said things to me on a similar vein about those posts, which are, I have to say, it's those are actually hard work,
mm-hmm.
but mostly because people send too many beautiful pictures. Not that they're too many in and of themselves, but more than we can really, conveniently
can't
accomplish.
Share everything.
And so, I'll get a file with, 25 photographs, but, I've got 20 churches sending them in for Laetare Sunday, so I have to make a selection. And that's painful, actually, because I think, oh, man, I really want to publish this photograph. I just don't have room for it. And so,
right.
But yeah, that's what we're aiming. That's the goal that we're aiming for, is to show the, all the positive things which are happening, which, I think it's true that a lot of people don't realize how many other people sort of share their visions and their ideas about where the church's liturgy should be going and how we can rediscover all of the beautiful and holy things within our liturgical tradition, all of our music, all of our sacred art, all of our good architecture. And so it's really nice to get a broader perspective on these things. I was at a liturgical conference a while ago, and Bishop Peter Elliott, who's done a lot of work for Good Liturgy, introduced me by saying, it's so nice to have NLM as a place we know we can always go and look there and find something encouraging and beautiful. And I was like, wow, that's I was very, very flattered by that.
Right, especially in the age of the internet, to use the internet to be inspired.
Yeah, it's wonderful that how this, I mean, the internet in so many different ways is making so much more information about how things can be done and should be done available to people in a way that even 20 years ago was just impossible.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Greg, and sharing especially your knowledge of Rome, which is both a lived experience for you in terms of its beauty and in terms of your faith. And we're just delighted to have had the opportunity to talk with you today.
Thank you very much. It's been great fun.
All right. Thanks, Greg.
You're very welcome. Take care.
Thanks so much for listening. If you have any topics you'd like us to discuss or people you'd like us to interview for future episodes, feel free to send us a suggestion via email or via our website, sacredmusicpodcast.com.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.